When Love Hurts, Eleanor's Journey to Freedom. Chapter 1. The Quiet Cottage. In the small, wind-swept town of Maplewood, Oregon, nestled among rolling hills and sleepy fir trees, lived a woman named Eleanor Reed. At 78, Eleanor had grown used to solitude. Her home, a modest wooden cottage on the edge of town, was filled with memories. Photographs lined the mantel, of her late husband Henry, who had passed away 2 decades earlier, and of their only son, Daniel, a boy once full of wonder and now a man with a family of his own. For Eleanor, days passed quietly. Mornings began with tea brewed in an old porcelain kettle and the scent of roses drifting in through the kitchen window. Her garden, lush and untamed, was her sanctuary. She tended to it with care, though her joints protested with every step. Roses, lilies, and wild marigolds bloomed under her watchful eye, and she often whispered to them as if they were old friends. Weekends were her favorite. That's when Daniel came with his wife, Melissa, and their 2 children, Avery and Jack. The children ran through the yard, their laughter ringing like bells, and Eleanor would bake cookies while Melissa scrolled through her phone. Daniel would talk about work, barely looking up, but Eleanor cherished these moments regardless. Yet as the years wore on, Eleanor's body began to falter. Her knees ached with every climb up the stairs. Her ankles swelled after hours in the garden. She once fell among her roses, her body too frail to catch itself. She laughed it off at the time, brushing dirt from her cardigan, but inside, a quiet fear bloomed. Chapter 2. A Difficult Conversation. One chilly October afternoon, after a particularly harsh fall while cleaning leaves from the porch, Eleanor sat across from Daniel and Melissa at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "It's getting harder for me to manage things here. I thought maybe I could come stay with you all." Melissa's smile tightened. She glanced at Daniel, who stared into his coffee. "Eleanor," Melissa said, her tone light but firm, "we weren't really planning on taking anyone in. The kids are in so many activities, and Daniel's work is. We just don't have the room," Daniel added quickly, without looking up. Eleanor nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "Of course. I understand." She smiled, small and strained, then changed the subject. They talked about Avery's piano lessons, Jack's science fair project. But a shadow had settled between them, and it would not lift. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her bedroom, watching the rain streak down the window. The ache in her hip throbbed, and not just from the fall. A deeper ache, one of being quietly discarded, pressed against her chest. Chapter 3. The Fall. Winter arrived early that year. Ice slicked the roads, and Eleanor grew cautious even walking to the mailbox. But despite her carefulness, the accident came without warning. She slipped in the bathroom one evening, crashing against the tile floor with a sickening crack. When she came to, pain radiated through her side. She lay there, whispering for help until morning, when a concerned neighbor noticed the lights still on and called for a wellness check. At the hospital, the diagnosis was clear: a fractured hip. Surgery followed, and then a recommendation: rehabilitation at a care facility. "Just for a little while," Daniel said. "Until you're steady on your feet again." The facility was clean, with floral curtains and an ever-playing loop of old television reruns. Eleanor made no complaint. She followed the nurse's instructions, did her exercises, and tried to be grateful. Then one day Daniel visited alone. No kids, no Melissa. He sat at her bedside, shifting in his chair. "Mom," he began, "Melissa and we've talked about it. It might be better if you stayed here. Permanently." Eleanor blinked. "I thought this was temporary." Daniel hesitated. We're really busy. You'd have care here. People watching out for you. It's safer." "But it's not my home," she whispered. He didn't answer. And in that silence, Eleanor knew what he wasn't saying. Chapter 4. The Truth Uncovered. 2 weeks later, a neighbor named Bonnie came to visit. A sprightly woman in her 60s with a sharp tongue and a kind heart, she brought Eleanor cinnamon bread and news. Did you know Daniel's been moving stuff out of your house? Bonnie asked, lowering her voice. And well, I heard from Margaret, who works at the courthouse, that the deed is now in his name. Eleanor stared at her. What? He transferred the house. While you were in surgery, apparently. I don't think they even told you. The room spun. Eleanor clutched the blanket on her lap. Her lips parted, but no words came. That afternoon, Daniel arrived with a man in a suit. This is Mr. Lawson, he said. He's helping us with some legal things. Mr. Lawson smiled too warmly. Just a few papers, Mrs. Reed. To help your son take care of things. Eleanor looked down at the document. They gave Daniel power of attorney. Control of her finances. Her pension. Her house. I'm not signing, she said. Mom, Daniel said sharply, this is for your own good. No, she said again, her voice rising. I'm not senile, Daniel. I know what this is. And I won't give up everything I've built for someone who won't even visit me. Daniel stood in silence, his jaw tight. Then, without a word, he walked out. She didn't see him again. Chapter 5. The Garden Within. Days turned to weeks. Winter faded into spring. Eleanor remained at the care facility, alone but growing stronger. She started journaling, pages upon pages of memories, heartaches, and wishes. Her words spilled out like seeds in soil. She joined a group therapy circle, where seniors talked about loss, aging, and what it meant to be left behind. It was there, in that circle of kind strangers, that Eleanor began to reclaim herself. Love doesn't mean sacrificing your soul, one woman said. Trust isn't blind, added another. Especially when it comes to family. And Eleanor, with each shared story, found her own voice again. She wrote in her journal, I thought I needed to forgive him for his sake. But the truth is, I forgive him for mine. Carrying this pain only keeps me in chains. And I want to be free. Chapter 6. Small Steps, Big Strength. Eleanor began to move with a steadier gait. The physical therapists noticed. The nurses smiled when she passed by, her walker replaced by a cane. But the biggest change wasn't in her steps, it was in her spirit. Each morning, she woke early, opened the curtains, and looked out at the tiny courtyard garden beyond the facility's lounge. It was nothing like her own garden back in Maplewood, but it held promise. The daffodils were poking through the soil, stubborn and bright. She found herself talking to them. One day, she asked the facility director if she could volunteer in the courtyard garden. It was rare, they said, for residents to want to do that, but permission was granted. Eleanor knelt among the planters, pruning, digging, planting marigold seeds she'd ordered online with her own money. Residents began to join her. At first, they just watched. Then one brought a watering can. Another pulled weeds. A man named Howard, an ex-mailman with a quiet demeanor, offered tomato seedlings. This place needed a garden, he said. You gave us something to look forward to. It wasn't the garden she'd lost, but it was one she was building with others. And that made all the difference. Chapter 7. The Visit. One Saturday afternoon, the receptionist knocked on Eleanor's door. You have visitors. Her heart skipped, uncertain. But when she reached the lobby, it wasn't Daniel, it was Melissa. Alone. I thought I should come, Melissa said, clutching her purse. Daniel's not. He's busy. Eleanor nodded, offering her a seat. For a long moment, they sat in silence. I didn't know what he was doing, Melissa finally said. With the house. With the power of attorney stuff. I found out a few weeks ago. I confronted him, and he said it was practical. That you'd want him to take care of everything. Eleanor didn't speak. I'm not here to defend him, Melissa continued. But I thought you should know I didn't agree with it. And I told him so. He hasn't been the same since his dad died, and I think he sees aging as a threat. Something to avoid, not embrace. I see, Eleanor said softly. Melissa hesitated. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For how cold I was. For how I dismissed you. Eleanor looked at her, not with anger but with weary understanding. We all carry fears, Melissa. Some of us hide them behind kindness, some behind control. She paused. And some of us finally learn to let go. Melissa reached for her hand. If you ever want to see the kids, I can bring them. I won't wait for Daniel to grow a conscience. Eleanor smiled. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something like grace. Chapter 8. Letters and Legacies. Eleanor never saw Daniel again. He stopped answering calls and emails. Later, she would hear from a neighbor that he'd rented out her house, taken a job in Seattle, and filed to liquidate some of her asset. She could have sued. The legal aid at the facility encouraged it. You have grounds, the young woman said. We can build a case. But Eleanor shook her head. I'm tired of fighting shadows. Instead, she began to write letters. Dozens of them. To the people who had shaped her life. Her sister who had passed, her best friend from school, her husband Henry. Letters she would never send, but poured herself into. She wrote one to Daniel too. You were once the boy who ran barefoot through the garden with jelly on your chin and hope in your eyes. I don't know where that boy went. I don't know who taught you that control equals love, or that money equals safety. But I hope, one day, you remember who you really are. Until then, I let you go. Not with hate, but with peace. And she folded that letter, placed it in a small wooden box, and locked it. Chapter 9. A Different Kind of Family. Eleanor's world grew bigger inside the care facility. She joined a writing group. She read poetry to the memory care residents. She helped organize a garden day each month, where families and staff came to plant, paint pots, and eat ice cream in the sun. She became close to Howard, the former mailman, and to June, a fiery widow who loved crossword puzzles. They played cards on rainy afternoons. They laughed over lunch. It wasn't the family Eleanor had planned, but it was a family all the same. One morning, she woke to find a small envelope taped to her door. Inside was a drawing, crayon on lined paper. A stick figure of a woman with flowers in her hands, and two smaller figures beside her. Avery and Jack had drawn it. Melissa had written a short note. Thank you for making room in your heart, even when we didn't make room in our home. Eleanor held the note to her chest. Her garden hadn't died. It had simply changed where it bloomed. Chapter 10. The Rose That Grew Again. A year later, Eleanor stood on a small wooden platform in the courtyard garden, now named Reed's Garden by the facility in her honor. The sun was warm. Children were laughing. Her cane rested against the bench nearby. She read aloud from her journal to a small audience. Staff, residents, volunteers, and some of their families. I once thought that growing old meant losing what we love. But I've learned that it means learning what to love next. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, they were real. But so were the kindness, the courage, the second chances. I used to think my story ended when I left my home. But it didn't. It just began again. The applause was quiet, respectful, full of warmth. Howard clapped the loudest. June dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Eleanor looked out over the garden. Roses in full bloom, their petals reaching toward the sky. And in that moment, she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. Epilogue, Where the Roses Grow. Years later, after Eleanor had passed peacefully in her sleep, a plaque was placed under the largest rosebush in the garden she had revived. Asterisk, in memory of Eleanor Reed, who taught us to bloom, even after the storm. Asterisk. Melissa brought her children every spring to water that rosebush. And each time, she told them stories, of an old woman with strong hands, a kind voice, and a garden that never truly died. And somewhere, in the soil and the sunlight, Eleanor's spirit lingered. Not in bitterness, not in regret, but in peace. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts or your own story of resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives that remind us all, it's never too late to bloom again. Thank you for being here.